Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name's Bertie Harrison-Brudinski, and today I'm talking about the military emissions gap with Lindsey Cottrell, Environmental Policy Officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. In recent years, Lindsey's work has focused on the unrecognised carbon footprint of the world's militaries, which does not need to be disclosed under UNFCCC rules. Along with Stuart Parkinson from Scientists for Global Responsibility, she developed an estimate for day-to-day military operations, not conflict, and they alone reached a staggering 5.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon cost of war is likely much higher. Reports in June 2024 projected that Israel's assault on Gaza will cost 60 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine will cost 175 million tonnes. These figures are significant and could have serious impacts on decarbonisation, but are often overlooked by campaigners, perhaps due to the sensitivity around focusing on less directly humanitarian wartime issues. Ukraine is now helping to change perspectives on this by pushing for more accountability and transparency around the environmental impacts of conflict.
I think there will be a realisation that you can't have green wars. It's just a oxymoron. It's not a possibility.
I began by asking Lindsey to introduce her work on military greenhouse gas accounting.
When we started to investigate and think about the military's contribution to greenhouse gases, and trying to find the data to understand that better, it was really surprising that it's not there, even though it is requested in some of the data that is submitted to the UN. So we work with colleagues from the Scientists for Global Responsibility, or another UK-based organisation, and we came up, we did do an estimate, which is 5.5% of all global emissions can be attributed to the military sector. So that's day-to-day military activities, from training, from running their estates, from buying all the equipment and all their supply chain. So that's a huge percentage to think that that's not really properly accounted for. It's only an estimate, and the estimate could only be done because the data sets are so poor. And then added to that, that's just your day-to-day, and we don't really know what the other added contributions are from conflicts as well, which will be significant. We're seeing more greater tensions around the world, and unfortunately they may mean that we're going to see even more contributions from the likes of conflicts as well.
The aviation sector, obviously not including military aviation, is 1 to 2% of global emissions, so they're looking at 2 to 3 times all flights.
I think it's about comparable to kind of aviation and shipping combined. And, the data sets that we had to use to do this 5.5% estimate, as we said, are really not brilliant. And we based this on looking at kind of military personnel numbers and there is some energy data that is published. So it's not a complete finger in the air estimate. It just highlights this lack of information, the lack of transparency. And we all know that for us to be able to manage and control and reduce our emissions, we need to know what the starting point is. And at the moment, most countries, militaries, don't actually know what that is. What we would want to see for next year is that the country's nationally determined contributions will be updated in February 2025. These are the kind of climate action plans that set out how countries are going to reduce their emissions. And at the moment, countries aren't talking about their militaries in those. And we need to see that as a minimum for countries that have actually developed a climate mitigation strategy. They should be talking about their militaries within their nationally determined contributions. And it'll be very disappointing if we don't see that next year.
In a kind of operational way, how difficult do you think it would be for many militaries to actually put that data together? Is it just a case of them not wanting to be fully transparent about what they're doing, or?
Well, I don't think, it depends which country you're talking about, of course, with respect to willingness to be transparent. And of course, the size of a military is going to heavily influence how easy a task it is. So, we recognise it's not an easy task at all, because you've got some countries have got very big militaries, billions of pounds worth, or US dollars of expenditure and they've got very big and very complex supply chains. But it's not an excuse to not stop doing it and not to look at it. It's not a quick fix, but we need to see militaries beginning to acknowledge that this is a requirement and needs to be done. Because what we do know is that because of the nature of militaries, obviously, they are not an easy sector to decarbonise. And there's going to be some areas which, just will be extremely difficult to do. But that doesn't mean you don't actually still try and understand what the carbon footprint is, so you know where that carbon budget is sitting and what can or can't be done. Because what the military can't do, society elsewhere is going to have to do it. And then there might be some difficult decisions further down the line as to, well, where do we want this carbon budget to sit? Do we want it to sit in the military, or are there other ways and other things we should be doing to think about how we manage those greenhouse gas emissions? Do we still want to be doing the same business as usual with respect to our militaries, or do we need to think of other strategies with respect to addressing some of the global tensions?
My understanding is that the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s just excluded the need to really do emissions inventories for militaries. Then the Paris Agreement put in this thing about voluntary submissions. Is that right?
That's correct. So the Kyoto, there was a push by the US to have the military exempt. Since the Paris Agreement, we've got kind of voluntary reporting, and there is a reporting category for the military's fuel use, but that's for the Annex 1 countries, so these are the developed countries, and they are requested to, but they don't necessarily have to, and some of them provide some data, some of them provide data as requested, but then when you start kind of going through it, it is quite difficult to understand what it actually means, because sometimes understanding whether they've reported international bunker fuels, so fuels that are used obviously in overseas operations and things, are they included? Where do they sit? And then the other countries, the non-Annex 1 countries, which still include some really big militaries, spending countries like India and Pakistan, China, of course, they aren't providing anything useful at all. Again, they're asked to provide this category of reporting, but it's just not being provided. And that's a big gap in the knowledge set, of course. And it obviously is going to be an extremely difficult challenge to ask of some of these states to provide this data and expect them to comply with that request. So as a starting point, what we've got to see is countries that are more progressive will and do demonstrate that it can be done and should be done, and the importance of doing it. And militaries, we're seeing a number of militaries putting out their climate mitigation strategies now. We're moving in the right direction, which is, and it's a positive direction, but we just need to see more countries come on board and doing the same.
What kinds of things do those strategies include? And do you see any signs that any militaries are decreasing their emissions so far?
These military climate mitigation strategies, the UK one, for example, is just 3 years old. So they're gone from their first phase of kind of understanding where they are, setting out their planning, looking at their reporting, and they'll be moving into the second phase next year. Of course, we need to see, and this is what we keep on saying about the transparency in reporting, to make sure that they're in line with what they're expected to achieve, and how are they setting targets. And with respect to the UK, it was really useful. The Defence Committee had a inquiry last year, which gave a very useful report about identifying what the UK government could be doing more with respect to setting targets, improving its reporting with respect to greenhouse gas reductions. So yes, we're seeing mitigation strategies coming out. We're not necessarily seeing the reporting yet to understand whether they're on the right track.
I was going to ask what Ukraine's role has been diplomatically in some of these efforts to reform these issues. I know that there was some kind of update in the spring at the UN Environment Assembly that they were involved in. I don't know if you could talk us through that a little bit and some of the other things that have happened during the Ukraine war.
What I would say about how Ukraine have been obviously supporting the call for better understanding on how conflicts contribute to climate change impact has been really important. And the work that Leonard de Klerk and his team has been doing on estimating conflict-related emissions has been really, really critical on putting a figure on it, and also putting a financial figure by looking at the carbon cost of conflict, and also understanding the makeup of a conflict and how the different where the different contributions come from. We developed a framework for looking at what we thought should be considered with respect to conflict-related emissions. And one of the things that Leonard's team also included, which is kind of something that we haven't really thought about either, was looking at the diversion of international aviation as well. And that was, quite considerable contribution. When you look at the categories, still reconstruction comes out as a significant one. I think in the latest it was around about 36% or something. And in Gaza, looking at the estimates for that, reconstruction was the largest proportion. Reconstruction and also pre-war construction as well, all the military defence assets that are built in both Gaza and Israel. But Ukraine, they've been pushing this at the UNFCCC, highlighting the impacts and hoping to see that that'll be a way that they can that can be used with respect to identifying reparations for the damage that's been caused, which is obviously an important element, and accountability as to who's responsible.
In the climate sector, a lot of conversations kind of lead back to ideas around circular economy or demand reduction or degrowth, or one of these things, basically kind of doing less stuff and producing less stuff is an effective way to drive down emissions. Do you think that this work and this push at international level and other levels to decarbonise militaries and to report their emissions could lead to a winding down a little bit of military operations and conflict, or is climate change likely to be such a driver of war anyway that we might be looking at things getting worse in the long term?
I would really hope so, that there is this recognition that it's behavioural change. It's not doing things, it's not business as usual. It's not just trying to do things differently. It's changing what we do. And that includes our militaries and our defence strategies and our diplomatic outreach and everything else. I think there will be a realisation that you can't have green wars. It's just a oxymoron. You can't. It's not a possibility. Hopefully, there'll be recognition that there's only so much you can do with respect to decarbonising the military complex, and there needs to be other strategies in place.
When you've worked with the mod in the UK or government and military institutions that would be involved in this kind of planning, do you ever hear recognition of the fact that you couldn't have green war, as you said? Or is there a kind of drive to make that happen, even though it might not really make sense?
I think there's a recognition that doesn't really make sense.
It must be hard to do that if they don't really believe in it.
I don't think that's correct to say they don't really believe in it. I think there is a lot that can be done to make militaries a lot less environmentally impactful than they are. So it's not that things can't be done; it's that there'll be a point where there's only so much that can be done because of the nature of militaries. So there'll be a point of which there'll be an end point, I think, and then now what decision do we take? But there is a lot of work to do to get to that point still.
These decarbonisation plans, are they mostly trying to replace the polluting elements of the military with new technologies and things, like similar to EVs and transport? Or are we seeing anything around actual changing styles of warfare?
There is talk about changing some kind of training operations and virtual training platforms and things like that to reduce the need. There is a lot of talk, of course, about utilising green technologies, sustainable aviation fuels, which is, of course, a completely different conversation about whether there is such thing as a sustainable aviation fuel and with respect to how advanced the technology is, how viable is that. And is it scalable to meet demand overall? So I think there is a mixture, probably more talking about switching to different technologies at the moment, as opposed to looking at actual overall military strategies.
My thanks to Lindsey Cottrell for coming on the show. If you want to read more about this topic, there's further reading in the blurb, and you can find more articles and podcasts, as always, on our website at www.landclimate.org. There's a lot more we could cover on this topic, including the environmental rather than greenhouse gas impacts of conflict. So let us know if you'd be interested in us covering these issues further. It's always good to hear what you think of these episodes. Alistair will be back in 2 weeks to discuss new research on temperature overshoot models. So until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.